The first time Maria Rourke heard Ralph Brooks speak, she nearly dropped the tray of biscuits she had carried across the entire length of Dusty Fork's only dining establishment, because a man who looked like that, tall as a fence post, jaw carved from the same red sandstone that rimmed the canyon to the east, eyes the color of a sky that couldn't quite decide between gray and blue, should have had something more to say for himself than the single word he offered to the room. Afternoon. That was it. One word delivered to the establishment at large. And then Ralph Brooks sat down at the corner table by the window, settled his hat on the chair beside him with the kind of quiet deliberateness that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before, and opened the leather-bound ledger he carried everywhere. Maria set her tray down on the serving counter and watched him for just a moment longer than propriety allowed in the summer of 1878, in the little railroad-adjacent town of Dusty Fork, New Mexico Territory. The town had been growing in fits and starts ever since the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway pushed its iron fingers further southwest. Settlers came through on their way to somewhere else, and some of them lost their momentum and stayed. Maria had arrived with her father, Declan Rourke, 3 years prior, when Declan had been convinced that a freighting business in a growing town was a surer bet than the depleted silver claim he'd been nursing in Colorado. He had been right about the town but wrong about his own constitution, and 6 months after they arrived, a fever took Declan Rourke quietly in his bed, leaving Maria with a half-built livery stable, $20 in a tin box, and the particular stubbornness that was the one reliable inheritance all Rourkes seemed to pass down through generations. She had converted the building beside the livery into a boarding house and dining room, and for 2 years she had run both with enough competence to keep herself fed and the property taxes paid. She was 24 years old, brown-haired and capable, with calloused hands and a directness of gaze that some men found unsettling and others found magnetic. She had learned early that in a frontier town, a woman without a husband was either invisible or under siege, and she had chosen, with considerable effort, to remain neither. Ralph Brooks was not a local. She knew that much from the start, because Dusty Fork was small enough that she knew every regular face by smell and habit. He was a stranger, and yet there was nothing uneasy about him. He sat at that corner table with the settled weight of a man who belonged wherever he placed himself. She brought him coffee without being asked, because she brought everyone coffee without being asked. It was simply what she did. And when she set the tin cup before him, she said, "Passing through or staying a while?" He looked up from his ledger. Those gray-blue eyes registered her with the same careful attention he had given the room when he entered, and then he said, "Staying." Maria nodded and went back to her work. That was the first day. Over the following week, she assembled his biography the way a person pieces together a quilt, one fragment at a time, from various sources that were themselves incomplete. Jonas Pell, who ran the feed store and considered himself the town's unofficial newspaper, reported that the stranger had taken a room at the hotel, had paid a month in advance, and had asked the hotel keeper only where he might find the land office. Pete Garza, who worked as a deputy under Sheriff Connors, mentioned at breakfast one morning that the man's name was Ralph Brooks, that he had ridden in from the north, and that he had no outstanding paper on him because Pete had telegraphed to check. Pete was thorough that way. Old Hattie Drummond, who was 80 and claimed to have lost her filter for inappropriate comments sometime around her 60th birthday, said loudly across the dining room one evening that the new man had the look of someone carrying something heavy but not willing to put it down in public. Maria thought Hattie was the most perceptive person in Dusty Fork, which was why she listened to her more than she let on. Ralph Brooks came to her dining room every morning for breakfast and every evening for supper. He always sat at the corner table. He always paid exactly what she asked, and occasionally left an extra dime beside his cup, not in the sheepish way of a man trying to curry favor, but in the matter-of-fact way of a man who considered good service worth acknowledging. He spoke to other patrons when they spoke to him, kept his answers brief, and never offered information about himself that wasn't directly requested. By the end of his first week, Maria had tallied his words for an entire day. Out of a curiosity, she refused to call anything more serious than that. Breakfast, good morning, coffee please, thank you. That was 5 words. Supper. That same single nod when she asked if the meal had been satisfactory, followed by, fine. Real fine. 2 words or 3 depending on whether you counted contractions. She counted 3 to give him the benefit. He crossed the street to let Mrs. Caldwell pass with her perambulator, tipped his hat and said nothing at all, which she marked as 0. He stopped at the smithy and exchanged 4 words with the smith about the shoe on his horse. Total for the day, somewhere between 11 and 15, depending on muttered things she hadn't been close enough to catch. She told herself she wasn't counting. She counted every day for a week. On the 8th day of his presence in Dusty Fork, a man named Cutter Walsh rode into town. Cutter Walsh was not unknown in the territory. He was the sort of man whose reputation arrived 3 days before he did, carried by nervous whispers and the kind of looks that passed between people who didn't want to be the one to say the thing they were all thinking. He had been a ranch hand, then a cattle thief, then something more dangerous that didn't have a single clean name. He was not an outlaw in the technical sense of having an active reward posted, but he lived in that gray land just outside the law's easy reach, and everyone in Dusty Fork who had been in the territory more than a year knew that when Cutter Walsh rode into a town, he wanted something from it. He wanted the land claim that Maria's father had filed 2 years before his death. Maria had known this was coming for several months. The land parcel adjacent to the livery, which Declan Rourke had staked a claim on as part of a territorial homestead provision, had become considerably more valuable since the railway surveyed a potential spur route past its northern edge. Walsh had been buying up surrounding parcels through a land agent named Birch who operated out of Santa Fe, and the Rourke parcel was the last piece he didn't have. She had received 2 letters from Birch, both offering her prices that were lower than the land was worth. She had sent back 2 letters declining. She had then received a 3rd letter that was less a letter and more a series of sentences that arranged themselves into something that felt like a threat without being specific enough to take to a judge. And now Cutter Walsh himself was riding down the main street of Dusty Fork, and Maria was standing at the window of her dining room watching him with her arms crossed, and the same feeling in her chest that she associated with her father's last weeks, the particular dread of watching something bad approach that you have no power to stop by wishing. Walsh had 2 men with him. He went first to the hotel, which was visible from her window, and she watched them dismount and go inside. 15 minutes later, he walked alone across the street and pushed open the door of her dining room. The room was between meal hours. There was one other customer, old Thomas Whitfield, who was deaf in one ear and working slowly through a piece of apple pie. At the corner table by the window, Ralph Brooks sat with his ledger. Walsh was a big man, broad through the chest, with a mustache that he wore like a piece of furniture he was proud of. He looked at Maria with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted through the simple force of not being denied it. "Miss Rourke," he said, "I believe we have business to discuss." "Mr. Walsh," she said, keeping her voice level, "I believe I already addressed that business by post. Letters don't always say what a face-to-face conversation can settle." He moved to the counter and put both hands on it, leaning forward in a way that was clearly calculated to reduce the space between them. "I'm prepared to offer you more than what Birch communicated, 15% above the last figure." "The last figure was already below fair market," she said, "and 15% above inadequate is still inadequate." Walsh's expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It was more of a subtle rearrangement, the way a face moves when it sets aside a polite approach and prepares a less polite one. "Miss Rourke, you're a woman running a boarding house and a livery stable on your own. The railway spur may or may not come through. That land is a gamble for you. For me, it's a certainty because I have the resources to develop it regardless of what the railway does. You'd be taking a sure thing and trading it for a maybe. I'm comfortable with maybes, Maria said. That's because you haven't considered what a definite no from me looks like. The room was very quiet. Thomas Whitfield, despite being deaf in one ear, had gone still over his pie. From the corner table, without looking up from his ledger, Ralph Brooks said, "Sounds like the lady said no." It was 6 words, spoken in a voice that was not loud but was absolutely clear. The way a mountain is clear against a sky, you simply could not miss it or pretend it wasn't there. Walsh turned to look at the corner table. He seemed to be recalibrating, which was what men like Walsh did when an element appeared in a situation that they hadn't accounted for. "This isn't your concern, friend." Ralph closed his ledger. He did it slowly and deliberately, the way he seemed to do everything. He looked at Walsh directly, didn't say it was. "Then stay out of it," asked what the lady said. Ralph's voice remained entirely even. "She said no." What followed was the particular kind of standoff that the frontier produced regularly, 2 men measuring each other across a room, calculating odds with the speed and precision of men who had done it before. Cutter Walsh was not a coward, but he was a businessman at his core, and businessmen who had been in his line of work long enough developed a functional instinct about when a situation could cost them more than it could gain them. The man at the corner table had the specific quality of stillness that suggested he had been tested before and had not been found wanting. Walsh straightened. He smoothed the front of his coat. He looked at Maria with the particular smile of a man deferring something rather than surrendering it. "I'll be in town a few days. Think on the offer." He walked out. Maria held very still until the door closed behind him, and then she released a long, slow breath through her nose and unclenched her hands from where they had been gripping the edge of the counter. Ralph Brooks picked up his ledger and resumed whatever calculation he had been making. She brought him a piece of pie he hadn't ordered, set it on the table without a word, and went back to the kitchen. Through the pass-through window, she watched him look at the plate and then look toward where she had gone, and she saw the corner of his mouth move in a way that might, under optimistic circumstances, be described as a smile. That was the moment, she thought later, when she understood that she was in some degree of trouble. Not the Cutter Walsh kind of trouble. The other kind, which was considerably harder to plan around. She began to pay attention to Ralph Brooks in a different way after that. Not the cataloging way of those first days, but with the particular attentiveness of a woman who suspects that a landscape she thought she understood contains depths she had not mapped. She learned that he came from a small spread in northeastern New Mexico, near the town of Cimarron, where he had run cattle for 6 years with his younger brother. His brother, whose name she eventually pieced together as Daniel, had died of a lung illness the previous winter. The spread had been Daniel's dream more than Ralph's, and with Daniel gone, Ralph had sold it to a neighbor and come south, carrying that ledger full of land surveys and cost calculations, looking for something to build that was entirely his own. She learned this not because Ralph told her any of it directly. She learned it through the patient accumulation of fragments, a question he asked Jonas Pell about water rights, a remark he made to Pete Garza about the quality of the soil in the Eastern Valley, the way he went quiet on a Tuesday evening when a man at the next table spoke of brothers in partnership, his hand stilling briefly over his coffee cup before he resumed. She was, she recognized, reading him the way she had learned to read weather, not by what it announced, but by what it did. On a Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after his arrival, she found him at the land office. She was there to file a response to a counterclaim that Walsh's agent Birch had lodged against one corner of her father's parcel, a maneuver designed, her instinct told her, to complicate her ownership rather than legitimately challenge it. The land officer, a thin, nervous man named Pruitt who was visibly unhappy about being caught in a conflict he wanted no part of, had asked her to come in with her original documentation. Ralph was there filing his own survey claim on a stretch of valley land east of town when she arrived. He acknowledged her with a nod, spoke briefly with Pruitt about the survey he'd commissioned, and stepped to one side. Maria spread her documents on the counter. Pruitt examined them with the concentration of a man hoping the papers would make his decision for him. She watched him, and she noticed when his brow creased at one point over the description of the parcel's northern boundary. "There's a discrepancy," Pruitt said unhappily. "The original survey marker descriptions and the resurvey that Mr. Birch submitted disagree on the northeast corner by approximately 40 feet. Because Mr. Birch's resurvey was conducted by someone who works for Mr. Birch," Maria said. "Be that as it may, there's a legal complication I'm not empowered to resolve in this office. It would have to go to the district." "The original survey used the Galena's Creek Fork as the boundary reference," said Ralph Brooks, from where he was standing to one side. Both Maria and Pruitt looked at him. "It's a standard reference point for that area," he continued, with the measured patience of someone who did not enjoy speaking in public, but was willing to do so when accuracy required it. "The Creek Fork is documented in the Territorial Survey record from 1873. The 40-foot discrepancy in the counter-survey disappears if you use the original reference. The creek didn't move. Somebody's chain man made a conveniently wrong calculation." Pruitt looked at the original documents, then at the counter-survey, then back at the originals. He looked like a man receiving unexpected permission to do what he had wanted to do anyway. "The original documentation does hold precedence," he said carefully. Maria looked at Ralph Brooks. He was already looking back at her with that steady gray-blue gaze of his. "Thank you," she said. "Land records," he said. "Studied a few." And that was apparently the entirety of what he had to contribute on the matter, because he gathered his own documents, tipped his hat to Pruitt, and walked out. Maria finished her business with Pruitt, emerged into the afternoon sunlight, and found Ralph standing at the hitch rail with his horse, a large gray gelding with an white blaze that appeared to have its own particular personality based on the way it was currently attempting to eat the button off Ralph's coat pocket. "You made that horse yourself out of leftover stubbornness?" she asked, because the horse was being extremely difficult about a simple tether. Ralph looked at the horse. "Something like that," he said. He looked back at her. In the full light of day, he looked less austere than he did in the dim dining room, she thought. The sun found lines around his eyes that suggested someone who spent a great deal of time outdoors squinting at horizons, and they softened him in a way that the dim light didn't. "Do you have a name for him?" she asked. "Coin." She waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Why Coin?" she tried. "Flip one. Could go any way." He said this with such complete seriousness that she couldn't tell if it was a joke until she saw that fraction of an inch movement in the corner of his mouth again. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh. It came out full and genuine, and she hadn't planned it. And she saw from the change in his expression that he hadn't planned for it either. Something in his face opened slightly, the way a window opens to let in air, just a small movement but unmistakable. "Maria Rourke," she said, extending her hand because it seemed suddenly absurd that they had been within 20 feet of each other every day for 2 weeks without formal introduction. He looked at her extended hand for just a moment, not rudely, but with that same quality of deliberate attention he gave everything, and then he shook it. His hand was large and calloused and warm. "Ralph Brooks." "I know," she said. "Pete Garza telegraphed about you." "Good to know," he said, in a tone that indicated he was not remotely surprised. "He said you had no outstanding paper." "I don't. He also said you rode in from the north." That's not very specific." Ralph looked at her, and there was a quality to his silence this time that was different from before, more conscious, more aware of itself, as though he was considering saying more and evaluating whether the impulse was a sound one. "Cimarron," he said at last. "North had a cattle spread." "Had," she noted. "Sold it." "Why?" The question landed in the air between them. She watched his jaw move slightly. the internal working of a man who does not naturally explain himself being confronted with a genuine question he was not sure he wanted to answer. "Lost the reason to keep it," he said finally. She understood from the way he said it simply, without self-pity, the way you state a geographical fact, that he was talking about his brother. She didn't say she understood because some things don't need to be named aloud to be heard. "I have coffee on," she said instead. "Afternoon is slow. You're welcome to a cup if you don't have somewhere to be." He tied Coin to the rail with some difficulty, because Coin had shifted to eating the entire pocket now, and he followed her inside. That was the afternoon she learned that Ralph Brooks was 31 years old, that he had been ranching since he was 18, that he could read a land survey with the facility of a schoolteacher reading a primer, and that he had a vision for the valley land east of town that was methodical and serious and oddly beautiful in its details. He did not offer these things in the way of a man performing himself for someone's benefit. She had to ask, and she did ask, and he answered each question with the minimum number of words that could contain an accurate answer, but he answered. She also learned, because she was watching carefully, that when he was thinking he turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands without drinking from it, that he had an old scar on the back of his left hand that she decided she would ask about on another occasion, and that he looked at her with a directness that was entirely unlike the way most men in Dusty Fork looked at her. Most men either looked through her as something functional and available, a means to an end, or looked at her with the particular mixture of calculation and hunger that she had learned to navigate. Ralph Brooks looked at her the way he appeared to look at land, like he was trying to understand it honestly, without wanting it to be something it wasn't. It was, she thought, the most respectful she had felt in a room with a man who was not her father in a considerable number of years. Cutter Walsh made his presence felt in the subsequent days with the persistence of a bad smell. He did not come back to the dining room, but Maria heard from Pete Garza that Walsh had met with the members of the town council, presenting himself as an investor interested in developing the eastern approaches to Dusty Fork as a commercial corridor, once the railway made its decision. Several council members were receptive. Jonas Pell, who had his own property interests in that direction, was openly enthusiastic. Walsh had also, according to Hattie Drummond, who had the miraculous ability to appear wherever information was being generated, been asking quiet questions about who owned what, where the liens lay, and what a woman running a boarding house alone might find difficult to resist if the right kind of pressure were applied. It was the last part that bothered Maria most. She had learned to manage direct confrontation. It was the oblique kind, the kind that worked on your circumstances rather than your person, that was harder to stand against. She was thinking about this on a Thursday evening after the supper rush had cleared, when Ralph came in for his meal and found the dining room empty except for her. She was sitting at one of the tables with her account book and a pot of tea that had gone cold, and she had the look, she knew, of someone doing arithmetic they didn't want to believe. He sat down at the corner table. She brought him his coffee and his supper: roasted pork, beans, cornbread, and returned to her own table and her arithmetic. After perhaps 10 minutes of silence, he said, without looking up from his own food, "Trouble with the numbers or trouble with Walsh?" She looked up. "Both," she said. "They're related." He set down his fork. He turned in his chair so he was looking at her directly. "Tell me." She did. She had not intended to. She had not made a habit of distributing her concerns around Dusty Fork, because she had found that problems shared in a small town had a tendency to become everyone's property while remaining entirely your own responsibility. But Ralph had asked in a way that was not nosy or performative, just straightforward, and she found herself explaining the whole sequence. Walsh, the land agent, the letters, the counter-survey, and now the quiet campaign with the council. He listened without interrupting. This was, she was learning, something he was extraordinarily good at: listening with the complete, unhurried attention that most people reserved for things they considered important, applied here to a 30-minute explanation of a small-town land dispute by a woman he had known for less than 3 weeks. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He needs the northeast corner specifically." "That's what I think too. That's where the railway survey crosses." "Have you spoken to the railway's land agent?" "I wrote. I haven't had a response." "The Santa Fe has an agent in Las Vegas." He meant Las Vegas, New Mexico, the town to the east, not anything in Nevada. "I know his name. Man named Sheridan. He's straight." Ralph paused, and she could see the familiar process of evaluation happening behind his eyes. "I could write. Former rancher up near Cimarron might carry different weight than a single woman in a disputed land claim. Not because that's fair," he added, with a flatness that made clear he knew it wasn't. "Just because that's how it goes." "I know how it goes," Maria said. "I expect you do." There was a moment between them that was full of something unspoken, but not uncomfortably so. The acknowledgement from both of them that they understood a world in which a woman's word consistently had to travel a longer road to reach the same destination as a man's. "Would you write?" she asked. "Already thinking what to say," he answered. He wrote the letter that same evening, at the corner table with her pen and her paper, and she was near enough while he wrote to read his handwriting, which was small and precise, and told her, somehow, exactly what she might have predicted: nothing wasted, everything clear. The following 2 weeks were, in Maria's experience of her own life, the kind of weeks that rearrange the furniture of a person without asking permission first. Walsh remained in town and continued his quiet maneuvering. Prewitt at the land office was under visible pressure. 2 of the council members who had been neutral began tilting toward Walsh's proposal. Sheriff Connors, who was a fundamentally decent man, but not one who enjoyed conflict with organized money, continued to monitor things without committing himself. And through all of it, Ralph Brooks came to the land office with her when she needed a second set of eyes on documents, rode out to the eastern parcel with her to walk the boundaries again with a compass and paper, spoke to Pete Garza about the particulars of territorial land law in a conversation that Pete then brought to Sheriff Connors, and wrote a second letter, this one to the district judge in Santa Fe. That was 3 paragraphs of such precise, evidence-based description of Walsh's counter-survey manipulation that it might have been drafted by a lawyer. He did all of this without being asked twice for any of it, without making a fuss about it, and without, she noticed, ever suggesting that she should simply sell and be done with it. One evening, after they had spent an hour at her kitchen table with the land documents spread between them, she asked him directly why he was helping. He looked at the documents for a moment and then at her. "Because it's right," he said, "and because Walsh is the kind of man who shouldn't win." "That's 2 reasons," she said. "You asked for 1, she shook her head, smiling in spite of herself. "No, 2 is fine." He looked at her then with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something more open than his customary reserve, something that had not quite made up its mind what it was. He seemed to become aware of it at the same time she did, and he looked back at the documents. "I'll survey the northwest boundary tomorrow," he said, with the precision of a man returning to solid ground. "Want to come?" "Yes," she said. They rode out early the next morning, before the heat built, with Coyne and Maria's own mare, a brown quarter horse named Tuesday, setting a steady pace east along the canyon road. The land at that hour was extraordinary in the particular way of desert country at dawn, all rose and copper. The mesas cut sharp against a sky that had not yet decided what shade of blue it intended to become, and the air carrying the smell of sage and the distant cool of a night that hadn't fully given up yet. Ralph was quiet in the way that she had stopped finding unusual and had started finding comfortable. He pointed things out when they were worth pointing out. A fault line in the canyon wall that confirmed what the original survey had indicated about the boundary, a stand of cottonwood that marked where water ran underground, and she rode beside him and received each piece of information and thought her own thoughts in the spaces between them. At the northwest corner, where a particular arrangement of 3 rocks had been set as the original survey marker. They dismounted. Ralph checked the compass, made notations in his ledger, and then stood and looked out across the valley. The eastern side of the valley opened out broad and golden in the morning light, and she could see, in his expression as he looked at it, the blueprint of something. "Tell me what you see," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Spring-fed creek about 2 miles east. Enough elevation change for drainage. Soil's better than it looks. A man would need to work it right. You could run a small herd on the valley floor and still have room for hay fields on the higher ground." He paused, would be quiet. "You want quiet?" He looked at her. There was something honest and unguarded in the look that he hadn't quite reached before, and she had the feeling of being someone who turns a corner expecting one view and finds entirely another. "I've had loud," he said. "Loud and then nothing. I'd rather build something that lasts than something that makes a lot of noise." She thought about her father, who had also wanted to build something lasting and had run out of time before he got there. She thought about the 2 years she had spent doing it alone, the steady grind of it, the loneliness she didn't often admit to because there was no use in admitting it when you had a boarding house full of strangers to feed. "I know that feeling," she said. Ralph looked at her for a moment, and then he looked back at the valley and she did the same, and they stood there together in the morning light looking at the same expanse of land from the same vantage, which felt, in its way, like a kind of conversation. The response from the Santa Fe Railway agent Sheridan arrived at the end of March. It was addressed to Ralph, but he brought it directly to Maria, unopened, and set it on her kitchen table. "It's about your land," he said. She opened it. Sheridan confirmed that the railway was indeed surveying a potential spur route that crossed the northeast section of the Rourke parcel, and that the Santa Fe had an interest in dealing with the legitimate owner of record, not, he added with what felt like pointed clarity, with a third party whose counter-survey claim had not been verified by the railway's own engineers. It was not a complete solution, but it was a door that opened in the right direction. Walsh found out about the Sheridan letter through whatever channels Walsh used to find out about things, and within 48 hours, his manner in town shifted from leisurely confidence to the particular brisk efficiency of a man who has realized that time is not on his side. He returned to the dining room on an April morning, and this time he brought both of his men with him, which was the kind of statement that didn't require translation. The breakfast crowd was still present, 6 or 7 people at various tables, including Hattie Drummond with her oatmeal and her magnificent indifference to danger. Ralph was at the corner table. Walsh approached the counter with a directness that was different from his first visit, less persuasive, more declarative. "My final offer, Miss Rourke," he said. "Same price I offered Sheridan's office through Birch for the whole parcel. You'll not get better. I'm not selling, Mr. Walsh. Then I'll take it through the counterclaim process and you'll spend the next 2 years in litigation you can't afford." He said it without particular malice, the way a man states a business outcome. "You'll lose the time, lose the money, possibly lose the land anyway and have nothing to show for it." "That may be," Maria said, because she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't a real threat. "But I'll still not be selling to you." Walsh looked at her. She watched him look at her and she held herself as her father had taught her, straight, still looking back, not down. From the corner table came Ralph's voice. "Letter from the district court should arrive about Thursday." Walsh turned. Ralph was looking at Walsh with complete calm. "Counter-survey fraud is a federal offense in the territory. Judge Sandoval in Santa Fe tends to deal with it quickly." He paused. "Heard that from a reliable source." There was a stillness in the room that was different from the usual morning quiet. Hattie Drummond had stopped eating her oatmeal and was watching Walsh with an expression of pure, satisfied interest. Walsh's jaw worked. His men stood behind him doing nothing useful. He looked at Maria, looked at Ralph, and made the calculation that men like him were ultimately always making whether the cost of pressing forward exceeded the value of the prize. "Your loss," he said to Maria. He left. Both men followed him out. 30 minutes later, according to Jonah's Pell, who saw everything from the door of the feed store, Cutter Walsh and his 2 men rode north out of Dusty Fork. And if that road led them back to wherever they'd come from, the town of Dusty Fork was not diminished by the knowledge. The room exhaled. Someone began talking. Hattie went back to her oatmeal. Pete Garza came in from outside where he'd apparently been stationed, because Pete Garza was thorough, and looked around with the expression of a man confirming that a situation had resolved itself without requiring him to do anything dramatic. Maria looked at Ralph. He was already looking at her. She crossed the room and stood at the edge of the corner table. "Was that true?" she asked quietly. "About the district court letter." "Wrote the letter Friday," he said. "It's a true letter. Whether it produces a court date is between Sandoval and the evidence." He paused. "The evidence is sufficient." "How do you know so much about territorial land law?" He thought about this. "Spent a winter in a line cabin with 2 books. One was a Bible and the other was a territorial statutes compendium." "Read both twice." She stared at him. He met her gaze with absolute seriousness. "Which one did you find more useful?" she asked. His mouth moved. The smile, the real one, the full one that she had only seen glimmers of before, arrived on his face for the first time in its entirety. And it was, she thought, like watching a landscape you thought you knew suddenly reveal a whole second valley. "Depends on the week," he said. She laughed, and he was still smiling when she walked back to the counter, and she carried that image of his smile with her through the rest of the morning like something she'd found, and wasn't yet sure what to do with, but absolutely was not setting back down. April in Dusty Fork softened. The evenings grew long and warm, and the canyon walls turned colors in the setting sun that defied adequate description in any language Maria knew, which was English, and the fragmentary Spanish she'd picked up in 3 years of living in the territory. She had begun, sometime around the middle of the month, going for walks in the evening after the supper work was done, down toward the edge of town where the houses thinned out and the land opened into the scrub and the immensity of the open sky. She was not surprised after the first week of this habit when Ralph appeared at the edge of her property on a Tuesday evening, not waiting but present, in the way that a landmark is present, simply there, reliable, factual. She fell into step beside him without discussion, and they walked out toward the canyon edge together, and she found that the silence between them had become a different kind of silence from the one at their beginning. Not the silence of 2 strangers who don't yet know the right words, but the silence of 2 people who have said enough to know the shape of each other and find the quiet restful. One evening she brought her father up, which she rarely did, because grief had a way of becoming public property the moment you displayed it, and she had always been cautious about that. She said, "My father would have liked this place, not the difficulties, just the land itself, the way it looks at this time of day." Ralph walked beside her. After a moment he said, "What did he want to build?" "Everything," she said. He was that kind of man. He always had a plan for the next thing and the next thing after that. The freighting business, the livery, then eventually a proper ranch. He never ran out of plans. She paused. He ran out of time. Miss him. It was not a question, and it was not a statement in the regular sense. It was just 2 words offered without embellishment, the way you lay a hand briefly on someone's shoulder, not to solve anything, just to indicate that you're there. "Every day," she said. They walked in silence for a while, and then she said, "What about your brother, Daniel?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought she had gone somewhere she shouldn't have. But Ralph's silences, she had learned, were not rejections. They were just the time it took him to locate the accurate words from among all the others. "Best person I knew," he said at last. "Quieter even than me, if you can imagine it. He had plans, too. The spread in Cimarron was going to be big enough to pass on by the time he was 40. He had it all worked out." A pause. "He was 28. "I'm sorry," she said. She said it simply, without dressing it up, because she thought he would prefer that. "I am too," he said. They stood at the canyon edge and watched the last of the light leave the sky. The evening star appeared, and then the first of the fainter ones, in clusters that spread east as the darkness deepened. Below them, the canyon floor lay in shadow, and the creek that ran through it made a sound that was too faint to hear directly, but that she somehow felt as a kind of presence. Ralph stood beside her with his hands resting at his sides, and she stood with her arms folded loosely, and the distance between them was perhaps 18 inches, which was a distance that had been shrinking, she realized, in increments so small that neither of them had been required to acknowledge it consciously. "I have enough saved," he said after a long while, "to start on the East Valley land by June. Not big, a foundation, whatever the first season covers. Will you build a house? Eventually. Start with a proper barn, easier to live in while you're working." He looked at her sidelong. "Practical." "My father would have said the same thing," she said. He looked back at the sky. "Your father sounds like someone with good sense." "He was," she said. He also said. She hesitated, because the next thing was personal and she'd been keeping it private, but this was a night for private things said aloud. He said the only investments that hold value are the ones you pour yourself into. He was right, Ralph said. She looked at him, and he was looking at the sky, and the half-light caught his profile in a way that was simply, without apology, beautiful, and she felt the full weight of what had been accumulating over the past weeks settle into something she couldn't call anything other than what it was. She loved him. Not the sudden, crashing kind of love that songs and dime novels described, the kind that announces itself with trumpets. The quiet, settled kind, the kind that was already there before you named it, that had been building like the canyon itself, layer by patient layer, and what she was feeling now was merely the recognition. She said nothing, because this was not the moment to say it, and because she was a woman who had learned the value of her own timing. But she was aware, riding home in the dark with the stars overhead and Ralph's horse pace-matching Tuesday without being directed, that something in the shape of her days had changed, and she was not afraid of it. May arrived, which brought two developments. A formal letter from the district court confirming that the counter-survey claim had been dismissed, and the original Rourke parcel boundaries confirmed as matters of record, and the wedding of Jonas Pell's eldest daughter to a young blacksmith from over near Glorietta Pass. The wedding was held on a Saturday in the small church that the town had completed the previous year, a plain white structure with a bell that worked most of the time, and everyone in Dusty Fork who was ambulatory attended, because Jonas Pell had been buying rounds at the saloon for a week in celebration, and it would have been ungracious to skip the main event. Maria wore the good dress she kept for occasions, blue-gray, fitted at the waist, the hem edged with a simple embroidery that she had done herself in the long evenings of the previous winter. She had put her hair up, and Hattie Drummond, upon seeing her arrive at the church, said loudly that Maria Rourke looked like something worth considerably more trouble than most men in this territory were capable of generating, which Maria took as a compliment. Ralph was there in a dark coat she hadn't seen before, which fit him well enough that she suspected he'd had it taken in at some point, and he was clean-shaved with his dark hair combed, and when he saw her walk into the church, he stopped the conversation he'd been having with Pete Garza mid-sentence. She saw Pete Garza register this and file it away with the thoroughness that made him a good deputy. They sat in separate parts of the church, she with Hattie and Mrs. Caldwell near the front, he near the back with Pete and some of the men she knew less well. But at the reception, which was held outside on tables in the Pell yard with lanterns strung up and Jonas Pell's younger brother playing fiddle, Ralph found his way to where she was standing watching the dancing and stood beside her with 2 cups of lemonade, offering her one. "Dancing man?" she asked. "No," he said. He said it with such complete certainty that she laughed. "Neither am I," she said. "Well, I can. I just don't usually have a good enough reason." He handed her the lemonade and they watched Jonas's daughter dance with her new husband, who was a stout young man with a happy face that suggested he had absolutely no idea what was wrong with the world because nothing in his experience of it had suggested there was anything to object to. They danced with the energetic imprecision of two people who know all the steps in isolation but are still working out the combination. "Good match?" Maria asked. "Looks happy," Ralph said. "That's enough," he considered. "Ought to be what it's built on." She turned to look at him. He was watching the dancers. His profile in the lantern light was the same clear, composed thing it always was, but there was something easier about him here than there was in daylight, as if the evening had given him permission to be less precise. "What would you build it on?" she asked. The question surprised him. She could see it, the slight change in the set of his shoulders, the brief pause before he turned to look at her. He looked at her for a long moment, with that direct, assessing gaze that she had grown accustomed to in the way you grow accustomed to weather, not that it stops affecting you, but that you stop pretending it doesn't. "Somebody you can be quiet with," he said, "and still feel like you've said everything." The fiddle went on playing. The stars were out in full force, brilliant and unhurried. Jonas Pell was dancing badly with his wife and laughing at himself. Hattie Drummond had acquired a cup of something that was almost certainly not lemonade. "That's more than 12 words," Maria said softly. Ralph looked at her with that expression she now knew was his version of undone, not dramatic, nothing crumbling or melting, just the particular openness of a man who has been seen clearly and has decided not to turn away from it. "Good occasion," he said. She moved very slightly, so that their arms were touching her shoulder against his upper arm, barely anything at all, the lightest possible fact of presence. And he did not move away, and they stood like that and watched the dancing until Jonas Pell called for a second tune, and the night went on warm and golden and full of ordinary happiness. He walked her home. The town was quiet, the lantern light behind them, the boarding house ahead with its lamp burning in the window because she always left a lamp. At the door she turned. "Ralph," she said. He was standing close enough that the word landed between them with no distance to diffuse it. "I've been keeping count," she said. "Of your words." He was very still. 12 on a good day," she said. "Sometimes fewer, but every single one has been worth waiting for." She looked at him directly because she had not come this far through 2 years of difficult aloneness to look at the floor at a moment like this. "Every one." The silence after that was the richest kind, the silence that exists not because nothing is being said, but because everything has been said and is in the process of landing. Ralph moved, closing the small remaining distance between them, and he cupped her face in one large, calloused hand with the same careful precision he brought to everything. And he said, so quietly that it was barely above the sound of the night wind, "Maria." Just her name. But she had grown very literate in his language, and she knew that her name, in his voice, in that register, meant all of the things that a man who spoke in longer paragraphs might have taken 3 minutes to say. She leaned up and kissed him, and he kissed her back slow and certain and sure, the way he did everything. And the lamp burned in the window and the canyon breathed in the distance. And Dusty Fork, New Mexico territory, turned on its axis under the stars the same as it always did, entirely indifferent to the fact that 2 people on its main street had just found the thing they had both, in their different ways, been riding toward for some considerable time. He pulled back and looked at her. His hand was still at her jaw, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with the kind of focused attention that she was beginning to understand he reserved for things he was serious about. "Been thinking," he said. She waited. "That valley land." He paused, organizing his words with the care of a man who knows they matter. "Big enough for 2, the plans I've got. They'd hold 2. She looked at him. "That is the least romantic proposal I have ever heard," she said, "and I still want to say yes to it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then the full smile arrived again, the one she'd been hoarding glimpses of for 2 months, and it made him look like someone entirely and wonderfully different from the contained, careful man who had walked into her dining room one afternoon and said a single word to the room. "Yes," he confirmed. "Yes," she said. He kissed her again, this time with something less careful in it, something that understood it was no longer negotiating but had arrived. and she kissed him back with the full force of a woman who had spent 2 years being entirely capable on her own and had no intention of becoming anything less, but who had been lonelier than she let on and was prepared, with considerable feeling, to be done with that. The summer of 1878 in Dusty Fork was remembered, by those who were paying attention, as the summer Ralph Brooks broke ground on the East Valley property, and Maria Rourke's boarding house had 3 new guests and a waiting list. It was also remembered, by those who were paying very close attention, as the summer that the two of them were seen everywhere in the particular configuration of people who are not yet formally committed, but are so visibly aligned that the formality is merely a matter of paperwork. They rode out to the valley land on Sunday mornings, which became a fixed habit. Maria on Tuesday, Ralph on coin, the gray gelding having expanded his original button obsession to include the corner of her saddlebag. She began to understand the land the way Ralph understood it, in terms of water and drainage and soil depth and seasonal light, and she brought to the shared understanding her own knowledge of what it took to run a working enterprise, which was different from theoretical planning, in ways that Ralph acknowledged with the directness he brought to all factual matters. They argued on 2 occasions. The first was about the placement of the barn. She thought it should be oriented differently to take advantage of the prevailing wind. He disagreed with reference to the drainage. It lasted 3 days, involved a significant amount of precise and passionate communication from both sides, and ended when they both walked the site again at dawn, and Ralph stood at the spot she had indicated, watched the morning wind come in, and said, "You're right," which he said with the completeness of a man who has no trouble with being wrong if the evidence requires it. The second argument was more personal. Hattie Drummond, who had no filter and was therefore the delivery mechanism for multiple items of community opinion, informed Maria in early July that it was being said by certain people. She did not name which people, because naming people was the one editorial line Hattie maintained, that a woman running a boarding house who was conducting a courtship publicly was setting a particular kind of example, and that the opinion of certain people was that the thing should be resolved properly and soon, by which was meant a wedding. Maria had brought this to Ralph that evening in the same spirit in which she brought him difficult facts without softening them, because she thought he deserved the unaltered version. He had listened, sitting at the corner table as he always did, and when she finished he looked at her for a moment. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think certain people should occupy themselves with their own business," she said. "And," she sat down across from him, "and I think we've both been reasonably clear about where this is going. I just want to make sure we're going to the same place." He looked at her steadily. "September," he said. "September what? Marry me in September. Ground will be broken by then. Frame up on the barn. Something to stand on." He paused. "Yes," she said. "September." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand so their fingers interlaced, and they sat like that with the evening coming in through the windows and the boarding house going quiet around them, and she thought that this was what her father had meant. The investments that hold value are the ones you pour yourself into. She was being poured into something, and it was being poured into her, and the combination felt like what land must feel like when water finally comes. The wedding was on the 14th of September, 1878. The same small church with the intermittently functional bell, which chose the occasion to function perfectly, 3 clear rings that carried across the flat roofs of Dusty Fork and out toward the canyon and possibly further. It was a modest affair by the standard of some, but by the standard of what Maria considered meaningful, it was exactly right. She wore white, which she had cut and sewn herself over the preceding weeks, with a small wreath of dried wildflowers in her hair that Mrs. Caldwell had helped her assemble. She carried herself down the aisle with the uprightness of a woman who has had a great deal of practice carrying herself, and has arrived at an occasion that makes the practice feel worthwhile. Ralph stood at the altar in the dark coat again, and the pressed white shirt, and he watched her walk toward him with an expression that was nothing like his ordinary contained reserve. It was open and present and full of something that he wasn't trying to hide or manage, and she thought she had never seen anything as good as his face in that moment. The minister asked them each the requisite questions. Maria's answer was clear and steady. When the minister turned to Ralph with the full traditional phrasing, "The loves and honors and in sickness and in health," Ralph said, in the quietest possible voice that nonetheless carried in the silent church, "I do." Two words that landed with the weight of 200, because every person in the room who had been paying attention for the past 4 months understood exactly the quantity of meaning Ralph Brooks poured into every word he said. Hattie Drummond cried openly. Pete Garza nodded with the air of a man who has confirmed a hypothesis. Old Thomas Whitfield, who had not quite followed all the proceedings, amiably applauded at what he determined to be the appropriate moment. After the church, the town gathered outside in the September sunlight, and there was food and Jonas Pell's brother with his fiddle, and someone had brought a guitar from somewhere, and the music was better than it had been at the Pell wedding. Maria danced with Ralph, who had apparently decided that a good enough reason constituted a wedding to the woman he loved. He danced with the careful concentration of a man doing something he doesn't do naturally but is determined to do correctly, and she moved with him through it and thought she had never loved anything more than this awkward, precise, wonderful man. 12 words, she said into his shoulder as they moved. He looked down at her. Getting more generous, he said. Married a woman who keeps count. She looked up at him. I keep count because every single one is worth it. He held her closer, and they moved through the music, and the canyon stood in the distance turning gold and copper in the late afternoon sun, and Dusty Fork threw a small and genuine celebration for two people who had found something real. They lived in the boarding house through the winter, which Maria continued to run with the same efficiency she had always brought to it, while Ralph worked the valley property through the shortening days. The barn frame went up in October, the walls in November, the roof before the first snow. He had hired 2 men to help, local workers who were honest and capable, and the 3 of them built with the purposefulness of people on a real deadline. Maria rode out most afternoons, and sometimes she stayed to work alongside them. She could handle a hammer and was not ashamed of knowing it, and the men worked around her with the matter-of-fact respect of people who understand quickly that a woman who shows up and does the work has earned her presence. In the evenings they came home to the boarding house, ate dinner with whoever was staying, and afterward sat in the small room behind the kitchen that served as their private sitting room, reading or talking or sitting in their particular comfortable silence. He had acquired, at some point, a second book to keep beside the Territorial Statutes Compendium. She had given him a copy of Twain's recent work, and he read it in the measured, page-by-page way he did everything, but she caught him smiling twice. On a January evening, she told him that there was going to be a baby. She told him the same way she told him difficult things, directly, sitting across from him, looking at him. He was quiet for a moment in the listening way, processing. Then he said, "When?" "August, I think, maybe July." He looked at her with that open expression, the one that was his undone face, his fully present face, and then he crossed the small room and sat beside her on the settle and put his arm around her, pulling her gently against his side, and she felt the slow, deep breath he drew that said everything. They stayed like that for a long time, the fire settling in the hearth, the wind outside doing what wind does in New Mexico in January, and the future arranged itself around them like furniture in a house being moved in, not all in place yet, but recognizable, real. The spring came in earnest, and with it the work of finishing the valley house. Ralph had been building it with the same careful vision he brought to everything, not large but right. 2 proper rooms to start, with a 3rd framed and waiting for finish work. A covered porch that faced east, toward the morning light. A kitchen garden space at the south side. A root cellar already dug and stoned. Maria walked through the finished rooms for the first time in May, when the plaster was dry and the floors were laid. She stood in the main room, the kitchen and sitting area combined, the way it was done in working ranches, and looked around at the window light and the hearth and the solid, honest walls, and she thought of her father and his plans, and she was glad he had left her stubborn enough to hold onto the land. She was also, she thought, about the size of one of Jonah's Pell's larger feed barrels, and she said so aloud, and from the doorway Ralph said, "You look fine," which was the kind of statement he only made when he meant it completely. "You're biased," she said. "Yes," he agreed without apology. They moved out of the boarding house in June. Maria put Mrs. Caldwell's eldest daughter, a capable 20-year-old named Ruth, in charge of the boarding house operations with a clear division of proceeds and responsibility, which arrangement Ruth took on with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The Valley House in summer was quiet in the way Ralph had described that first morning on the canyon edge. The mornings came in gold and cool, and the creek sound was there if you stood on the east porch and listened, and the valley floor held its color through the day in the way valley land does when water is close to the surface. Ralph was building the cattle operation from the ground up, a small herd to start, purchased from a rancher near Cimarron who had excess stock and whose name, delivered with a brief note of context, told Maria that Ralph had probably known this man in the years he spent up there, and that this small transaction was carrying some weight of memory alongside the commerce. He didn't say that, but she read it the way she had learned to read him, which was the way you read country you love, not looking for the words, looking for the meaning under them. He was also, with a patience she found remarkable, teaching himself to say more, not dramatically, not with any announcement. But she noticed, through the spring and into the summer, that his sentences were growing, not long, never long, but occasionally 3 words where 2 would have done, occasionally a full thought rather than half of one. Not because anyone asked him to. She had never asked him to, but as though, having found someone who valued what he said rather than how much of it there was, he had gradually become less concerned with the economy. One evening in late June, sitting on the east porch in the last light, watching the valley go amber and still, he said, out of a silence that had been going on comfortably for the better part of an hour, "I used to think talking too much made things less true. Like the words used up the meaning." She waited. "Still think that's mostly right," he said, "but I've been thinking it might work the other way too sometimes, that the right words make something more real, more certain." He looked at her. "I love you," he said. "Saying it makes it more real, I think, even though it was already real." She looked at him, this man who used his words so sparingly that each one carried the weight of 10, who had just said 8 words as though they were simple, which they were, which was perhaps the most difficult thing about them. "I love you," she said. "And yes, saying it does make it more real." He took her hand, and they sat in the evening and watched the first stars appear, and the baby moved, and the valley held them both in the particular way that land holds people who have chosen it honestly. The baby arrived on a Tuesday in late July. Not the horse, her daughter, though Ralph pointed out with his characteristic humor that this was at least consistent, and it was not easy, as first births seldom are, but Maria was strong and Mrs. Caldwell had come out from town to help, and by the time the sun was fully down there was a baby boy in the Valley house. A boy, broad-shouldered even at birth, with Maria's dark brown hair and Ralph's deliberate way of looking at things. Ralph held him with the concentrated care of a man handling something infinitely valuable and not yet certain of his own steadiness, and he looked at the baby's face for a long time without speaking. "What do you think?" Maria asked from the bed, watching him. "Daniel," Ralph said. He looked at her over the baby's head, and his voice had something in it that he almost never showed, a fragility, a raw edge, quick as a flash of light and then covered again, but she had seen it. "Yes," she said. "Daniel," Ralph looked back at the baby. He nodded once slowly, the way he confirmed important things. "Daniel Brooks," he said quietly, to the baby specifically, as though making an introduction. Daniel Brooks regarded his father with the unfocused, absolute seriousness of the newly arrived, and the valley was quiet, and the night was warm, and the fire Mrs. Caldwell had set in the hearth burned steady and small. The year turned. Dusty Fork continued to grow. The railway spur decision came through in the spring of 1879, and the answer was yes. It would run along the northern edge of the valley. The Rourke parcel's value doubled in a month, and Maria received 2 more letters from land agents, which she filed in the hearth. She had other investments now. The cattle operation's first full year produced modestly but solidly, which Ralph considered satisfactory, and Maria considered excellent given that it was the first year. He expanded the herd in the spring with the same methodical care he brought to everything, not more than the land could carry, not less than the operation needed to be viable. He hired a hand, a young Apache man named Thomas Kay who had grown up near Cimarron and knew horses and cattle with a fluency that made Ralph's short sentences the primary language of the operation, since Thomas was almost as quiet. This was its own kind of comedy, Maria running the household and the kitchen garden, and the books and Ruth's operation at the boarding house by correspondence, in a state of constant purposeful motion, surrounded by 3 of the quietest individuals she had ever encountered, including her own infant son who had apparently inherited his father's commitment to economy of expression, and did not cry when a withering look would do. She loved every bit of it. She loved the mornings when Ralph came in from the early check before full sunrise, smelling of horse and cold air, and the coffee was ready, and Daniel was awake in the wooden cradle that Ralph had built in February with the same careful precision he brought to fences and survey markers. She loved the way Ralph sat with Daniel in the evenings, the baby settled in the crook of his arm, while Ralph read from whichever book was current, his voice low and steady, the child apparently finding the cadence as settling as Maria did. She loved the Sunday mornings they still took, now with Daniel in a sling or, when he was older, up in front of Ralph on coin, who had, with age and responsibility, become somewhat less chaotic, though he maintained his interest in pockets, riding the land together and talking or not talking and looking at the same country from the same vantage. She loved the evenings when he told her things. Not often, not much. But the things he chose to say, after a silence, were always the things most worth saying, and she had long since stopped waiting for quantity and was completely satisfied with the quality, which was exceptional. The winter of 1879 brought a snowfall that covered the valley floor 3 inches deep, which was unusual enough that people came out from town to look at it. Ralph spent 2 days making sure the cattle were settled, and the barn was closed against the cold, and Maria kept the fire going, and made the kind of thick bean soup that required the whole day on the range and produced something magnificent. On the 3rd evening of the snow, with the valley white and still outside, Daniel asleep and the fire at its best, she told Ralph that there was going to be another baby. He was quiet. She was watching him the way she always watched him. Good, he said. She waited. More than good, he said. He looked at her with his full, steady gaze and the open expression that was his particular form of love made visible. Best things I've done in my life, he said slowly, choosing each word, are the things I've done with you. It was 14 words. She was counting, she always was, gently, affectionately, the way you count your heartbeats when you've just run somewhere and are catching your breath and are grateful, simply grateful to be doing so. That's almost a speech, she said. Don't push it, he said. And she laughed and he smiled, and Daniel stirred in his sleep, and the snow went on falling outside, and the valley held them, and the fire burned, and they were as completely home as it is possible for people to be. The second baby was a girl, born in the summer of 1880, with Ralph's gray-blue eyes and a voice that suggested she had decided, upon arrival, to make up for every word her father had ever left unsaid. They named her Clara after Maria's mother, whom Maria had lost when she was 10, and whose particular brand of stubborn competence Maria had decided, upon mature reflection, that she had inherited. Clara Brooks was 6 months old and already managing her father with a combination of those gray-blue eyes and a remarkable set of lungs when Maria found Ralph sitting on the east porch with Clara balanced on his knee, having a conversation. He was talking to her in his ordinary measured way, and Clara was responding with a series of sounds that were not yet words but had the emphatic shape of someone making important points, and Maria stood in the doorway and watched for a long moment without announcing herself. Ralph said something low and quiet to Clara. Clara appeared to reply at length. "She's got a lot of opinions," Maria said. Ralph looked up. He looked neither self-conscious nor surprised at being found talking to his infant daughter. "Gets that from you," he said. "Is that a complaint?" He considered. "Observation," he said. She sat down beside him, and Clara immediately redirected her considerable communicative energy toward her mother, and Ralph sat with the quiet, settled satisfaction of a man who has built what he intended to build and found it better than the plans promised. Dusty Fork was a different town. In 1880, from the town Maria had arrived in 7 years before. The railway spur had come through, and the town had grown substantially. New businesses, new families, a proper schoolhouse that had been the object of considerable community effort and debate. Ruth Caldwell was running the boarding house with authority and had, some time in the previous year, married the blacksmith who had arrived to help extend the railway depot, which was the kind of efficiency Maria approved of. Pete Garza had been elected town marshal, superseding the retiring Sheriff Connors, and ran the law with the same thoroughness he had always brought to it. Hattie Drummond was still alive and still devastating, having recently delivered her opinion to a newly arrived speculator that his plans for a land development scheme were ambitious in exactly the way that revealed how little he understood about the territory, and that he should perhaps consult someone who actually knew the land before he began spending money. She had been correct, as she almost always was. The valley operation had grown to a sustainable herd of 60 cattle, and the beginning of a horse breeding component that Ralph had introduced carefully, purchasing 3 quality mares, and working with Thomas K. through the calculations of what the land could support. It was not large by the standard of the great Texas ranches, but it was theirs entirely, with no debt on it and no compromises in how it had been built. On a September evening, the 2nd anniversary of their wedding, Maria and Ralph sat on the east porch as they had sat hundreds of times, watching the valley go through its evening colors. Daniel, now 2.5, was inside asleep. Clara, 4 months, was in the sling across Maria's chest, also asleep with the boneless conviction of the very young. 2 years, Maria said. Ralph looked at her. "Feels longer," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Better way than that," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. "Means it's been full." "Not short," he paused. "Every day of it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They sat and watched the last color leave the canyon walls and the first stars come in. She thought about everything that had happened in the years between her father's death and this porch on this evening. The loneliness and the difficulty, and the 2 letters from Cutter Walsh's man Birch that she had burned in the hearth, and the morning she had looked up from her account books to see an angular, gray-eyed stranger settle himself at a corner table and offer one word to the room. She thought about counting his words in those first weeks, that private record she'd kept of his economy of expression, and how it had started as observation and become something like love before she had consciously recognized the transition. She thought about how the smallest words, delivered right, carry everything. "Afternoon. Staying. You're right. Yes, Daniel, I love you. What are you thinking?" he asked in the quiet voice he used when they had been still for a long time. "Counting," she said. She felt his breath come out slow, almost a laugh. "Still. Always," she said. She lifted her head from his shoulder to look at him. "Every one of them, Ralph. Every single one has been worth it." He looked at her with that completely open face, the one that was the real him, the one that existed underneath the reserve, not hidden, just quiet, just waiting for someone who was willing to sit still long enough to see it. "Good," he said. And then, because they were 2 years past the beginning and the night was warm and the valley was theirs, and the children were asleep, and there was nothing left to prove or negotiate, he kissed her in the way that by now she knew as well as she knew his voice, slow and sure and entirely present, the way Ralph Brooks did everything he cared about. The canyon stood in the dark behind them, immovable, ancient, carrying its record of centuries the way a person carries their own history, in the strata, in the lines, in the colors that change with the light. The creek moved in the valley below. The stars turned slowly east as they always had, as they always would. And in the East Valley house, in the territory of New Mexico, in the particular year of 1880 when the frontier was still being decided, and the land was still being learned, two people sat on a porch with their lives built around them, and found it was enough, more than enough, to be exactly where they were. The years after that were full years, full in the way Ralph had meant when he said it felt longer. Daniel grew into a serious, dark-haired boy who followed his father around the operation with the same quiet attention his father brought to everything, and who turned out to have Maria's quickness of mind and her directness of speech combined with Ralph's capacity for stillness, which was a combination that made him remarkable in a classroom and formidable among other children. He was also, by the time he was 5, deeply invested in the horses, spending long afternoons in the barn with Thomas K. learning the vocabulary of the animals in the patient, observational way he had learned everything. And Thomas, who had by this point been part of the valley operation for years, and was as much a fixture of it as the barn itself, taught him with the same quiet thoroughness that characterized everything he did. Clara, as anticipated, was the voice of the household. She was bright and decided, and had opinions about everything from the arrangement of the garden to the way supper should be served, and she delivered these opinions with the confidence of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt her own observations. Ralph dealt with her the way he dealt with everything that surprised him, with careful attention and no visible alarm, and Maria thought, on many afternoons watching the two of them in conversation, that Clara was the one person in Dusty Fork who could reliably get Ralph Brooks to produce more than 12 words on a good day, simply by asking the right questions and waiting, with the patient certainty of someone who understood exactly where she had learned how to wait. In 1882, a third child arrived, a boy they named Patrick for Maria's father, whose full name had been Patrick Declan Rourke, and Patrick announced himself with an energy that suggested he had arrived with a complete agenda and was already behind schedule. He was a large, cheerful baby who grew into a large, cheerful child who was apparently constitutionally incapable of stillness, and the quiet valley house became significantly less quiet in ways that everyone found mostly delightful and occasionally challenging. Ralph handled Patrick with the equanimity of a man who had built a barn in the snow and managed a cattle operation through a drought, and was not therefore going to be undone by one extremely lively child. He was patient in the way that deep water is patient. You wouldn't call it passive exactly, but you also couldn't ruffle it on the surface. Maria watched him with the 3 children on a Sunday evening in the summer of 1883, Daniel 7, Clara 3, Patrick just past 1, and in the process of dismantling everything within reach, and felt the full accumulation of the years they'd built together, layer on layer the way the canyon built itself, each stratum sitting on the last, the whole thing more solid for the weight. She had sold the boarding house properly to Ruth that spring, not just the management but the ownership, for a fair price that left Maria with capital she folded back into the valley operation. There was no longer any divided attention, no townside obligations, just the land and the family and the work of both. The boarding house had been her survival after her father died. The valley had become something else entirely, not survival, but choosing, every day, the life she wanted to live. That was the difference, she thought, and it was a significant one. On a fall evening, with the children inside and the kitchen lamp burning golden in the window, she and Ralph sat on the porch with coffee and the particular good tiredness of people who have worked hard and done it right. The valley was doing its autumn colors, the cottonwoods yellow along the creek line, the grass turning, the sky the deep clear blue that New Mexico fall produced like a gift. "You're quiet," Ralph said. "Learning from you," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "5 years," he said. "You haven't learned to be quiet yet." "I'm quiet on the inside," she said. "Very serene, you wouldn't believe." He made the sound that was his laugh, not quite a full laugh, but the breath and the warmth of one, the shape of amusement in a man who expressed joy the way he expressed everything. She had collected those sounds the way she'd once collected his words. "Ralph," she said after a while. "Yes. Are you glad?" She didn't specify. She had learned over 5 years that specifications were mostly unnecessary. He looked at the valley for a long moment, at the cottonwoods and the dimming sky and the first evening star appearing over the canyon rim. He looked at her. "Every day," he said. 2 words. But she had them calibrated perfectly, and she knew what they contained: the sold cattle spread in Cimarron, the long road south, the corner table by the window, a woman who brought him coffee without being asked, the land records and the courtroom letter and a September wedding and 3 children and 5 years of evenings on this porch. The brother he'd lost and the family he'd built. The quiet life he'd said he wanted, held in both hands, exactly as described. 2 words containing everything. She leaned over and kissed his cheek. He turned and kissed her properly, and she tasted coffee and the particular warmth of him. And from inside the house she could hear Daniel telling Clara something in his serious 7-year-old voice, and Clara arguing back and Patrick making the general celebratory sounds that appeared to constitute his primary mode of existence. The valley held them all. The canyon stood. The creek moved in the dark below. The stars multiplied across the enormous New Mexico sky. And Maria Rourke, Maria Brooks, she was now, had been for 5 years. Though she kept both names because her father had given her one and Ralph had given her the other, and she was not about to set either one down, sat on the east porch of the house they had built together, with the land her father had fought for and she had held, with the man who spoke a dozen words on a good day and had been worth every moment of the waiting. She thought, this is what a life is. Not the grand gestures and not the dramatic turnings, though those happen and they matter. It is this, the porch in the evening and the coffee and the quiet man beside her and the children inside, and the land that holds you and the years that have been full. This is what it is, and it was enough. It was, in every way that actually counted, everything.